hello everybody back home and in the offices joining us here. My name is Untitled from Department of Digitalization. I will set us off here by talking more generally about the word sharing itself, because it's been used quite a lot, and it means and its understanding varies from situation to situation. So I would like to clarify all the different meanings we attach to the word sharing and how it has changed over time. So if we start off with the actual meaning of the word sharing, or what some of us would call real sharing, this has been around since the beginning of humanity, basically. It is what some people say makes us human, because we share values, we share norms, we share stories. And this sort of interaction is non-reciprocal and non-commodified in the sense that a community, like for instance, a family household, commonly jointly owns resources, and they are not exchanged. So I contribute something to the household. It doesn't mean that somebody owes me something in return. So the classic example is the family, obviously where a family shares the food at the dinner table. Typically, parents don't ask their children to pay for the food they get served. Of course, formally, it's the parents who buy the food, but in practice, it's the family that shares food at the dinner table. And we have from anthropologists, there are studies that show how old an institution this kind of sharing is. We know, for instance, from tribes in Ecuador, who very much are based on this typical understanding of a sharing economy in the sense of joint ownership. So some tribes go even so far that they share illnesses. So if you imagine a household, a member of that one household becomes sick, is physically sick, everybody else joins in eating certain foods in order for the whole family to recuperate. So literally the family shares the illness. Now we have modern versions, contemporary versions of that. If you think about Wikipedia, where obviously, legally speaking, it's the Wikimedia Foundation that owns Wikipedia, but in practice, it's the community of Wikipedians that jointly share the knowledge. And if you contribute your knowledge to Wikipedia, you don't expect anything in return. Now that is a bit different from sharing in the sense of gift giving, where it is reciprocal. So gift giving implies obligations of returning the gift in kind as a symbolic gesture, but it's not commodified in the sense you don't put a price on a gift. So if you think about sharing your birthday cake, you obviously still maintain control and ownership of your birthday cake, but you share it with your friends, and you expect that when your friends have a birthday, they share their birthday cake with you. And again, anthropologists have shown us that this is a very old tradition and institution. We know of tribes that travel kilometers across the sea just to give gifts to other tribes or other communities on other islands. And that's for the sake of power and social prestige and status. So there is no value in the gift itself. It's the sharing of the values that come with it, the symbolic value of it. Now, what we mean, oh yeah, I'm sorry, before I forget, we have contemporary versions of that too. For instance, if you think about Napster, regardless whether you think it's legal or illegal, the ethos of Napster was that you share your music collection as a gift and expect that the others joining Napster share their music collection as a gift back. So that was the underlying value and agreement of Napster. Now, when we talk about sharing economy today, and we think about Airbnb and Uber, that's obviously a very different beast altogether. Here we think about reciprocity, so I owe you, and also about commodification in the sense that you pay somebody for the right to stay at their home for a limited amount of time. And this is, we call it sharing, but it has, as you now see, nothing to do with what we used to call sharing. And what Evgeny Morozov, the political economist, describes as the incorporation of the informal economy into platforms. So that's what we more and more associate with the word sharing economy. The informal participants in informal economy sign up on platforms so they can participate in that form of economy. And of course, you can imagine, especially in developing countries, there's huge value in the informal economy. So if you can tap into that, there's also huge value to be captured. And then, of course, explains why also a lot of investment money goes into sharing economy, especially in India, if you think about that. And then governments are interested in tapping into that too, so they can collect taxes about the informal economy. And I think this would be a good place to have first Paul.
Yeah.
Talking of Uber.
Yeah, great. So I'll just launch the first poll. and it's here. And you guys out there, please vote, and then I'll share results in just a few seconds. So we'll just give you time to answer. Should Uber return to Denmark? This is kind of a political question.
Yeah, we start with a good one.
Yeah. So we need just a few answer. Okay, that was 30 seconds. Let's just close it and then launch the poll. So this is the result. So I'm just gonna. Can you see it from here?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, just 1 second. Okay, so we had 17% saying yes, and we had the same arm saying no, and then half of them said depends, and there's 17% saying undecided.
It's pretty evenly matched, yeah.
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 So would you comment on this result?
No, absolutely. So there are, of course, a lot of factors coming into play in this consideration. So one, of course, would be to allow people to participate in these kinds of activities. Also allowing then the government to control and to tax this kind of pseudo-sharing economies. On the other hand, the counter-argument would be that it is in Uber's business model, despite of what Uber is actually promoting, it is in the business model to get as many cars on the street as they can, so they reduce the amount of time people are waiting to be picked up by the car. So which means that as a negative externality or consequence of that, we may actually have more cars on the roads rather than less cars, which would increase congestion. So there is a pro and cons of that. Yeah. No, but thank you for your answer. So having established that, what we hang on, we have a little hiccup here. There you go. So the meaning of sharing and the sharing economy is changing, and also the practice that comes with it. And that is in itself an interesting development, because we consider sharing to be a key sentiment of today's digital society and economy. We all share our private life on Facebook, and we share our data with Google. It's all about sharing, is caring attitude. So it changes in the sense that Joanna and I, in our research, in order to bring some clarity to today's understanding of sharing economy, we talk about 3 different developments that have to come together in order to in order to have something that we call the sharing economy. And one is what is referred to as access over ownership. So it has become acceptable societally that you don't have to own things in order to consume things, right? A typical example is that younger generations today don't put that much value into owning a car. It's more important to actually have access to a car. So the switch from buying in order to consume to subsidized products, and of course, we all are familiar with the best examples here, which are subscription streaming services such as Netflix and Spotify. You don't buy a CD, you subscribe and stream a CD or a song over Netflix. So this is when we talk about access-based consumption or on-demand economy. This is one aspect of the sharing economy. Then the second aspect is the rise of peer-to-peer networks. So we have platforms where people can, and this includes now casual participants, private individuals, can participate in interactions and then also transactions. These are coordinated through trust and reputation systems. So think about eBay and YouTube are very good examples of platforms allowing peer-to-peer transactions, especially in the case of eBay. And when we talk about the peer-to-peer economy or collaborative economy, this is usually what we mean by that. And then the third element or development is the allocation of idle resources. Here we used terms like collaborative consumption or circular economy. And the idea is to tap into privately owned resources, which are usually idle. So for instance, a typical car is idle for 80% of its time, which is quite an expensive luxury good to have. So we tap into privately owned resources, assets, and labor, and that involves the casual participation of individuals in the economy. Think about IKEA second-hand campaign, or for instance, sharemystorage.com, where you can rent out your own closet at home for other people to use as a storage device. Right. So nothing of this is new. As always in our case, digitalization changes things, but it's really nothing new under the sun. We know that neighbors are lending each other tools without paying for it. We have been doing that for centuries. We donate blood, so there is sharing in that sense too. And second-hand shops have been around for a long time as well. So nothing really new under the sun in terms of practices. What we are suggesting, though, is that what makes a huge difference is the rise of platforms that come with it as a business model. And maybe we can have the second poll now, and I pass on to my colleague.
I'll just launch the next poll.
Yes. So I'm Ioana Constantiou. I'm also working with Attila at the Department of Digitalization at Copenhagen Business School, and we work together a lot on digital platforms and especially sharing economy platforms.
Yeah.
So,
yes, should it be here?
About the disruption.
Disruption, yeah.
So it's this one.
Okay. So before we move on, we would like to figure out what you think about your industry, whether you think it will be disrupted or not by sharing economy platforms.
Yeah, cool. So we'll just give you 30 seconds to answer the poll, and I can see you already started. And yeah, so 20 seconds of silence. Do you think your industry will be disrupted by sharing economy platforms? And I think we will close the poll now and then share the results. So we had 57% saying yes, and then you had 14% saying no, and 29% saying I don't know.
Well, that's a very representative view of how people see sharing economy platforms. We have some very strong examples in the hotel industry, in the transportations, in other environments where we have retail services that have been at least challenged, if not disrupted, by sharing economy platforms. And we have other environments that they're not directly, the implications of sharing economy are not directly visible yet. But let's see a little bit more explicitly, what are the sharing economy platforms? And I guess if you are familiar with digital platforms in general, what we see is a similar situation. So basically, they somehow allow supply and demand to meet without all this intermediation that we had before, but only on the platform that works as a two-sided market, where individuals are meeting other individuals that demand and supply a particular resource that would provide a service, right? And then the platform is in control of the financial transaction taking place. And what they offer is matching services. So they try to optimize the best matches for each of us that demand something with those that they can supply something. And as most of the digital platforms are building on network effects, which I guess you are familiar, but in case you are not, let me briefly remind you, it has to do with the size of a network that...
Just 1 second.
Yes.
I don't know if it's... Is it...
It should
it's
be.
good. Yeah, maybe we should put it here. I just had some...
So about the network effects, the size of the network, the more people participating in a particular platform, the higher the value for the participants. And because of the two-sided marketplace that we described before, the higher the number of people demanding a service, the higher the value for those supplying the service. So we also have the indirect network effects. So why am I saying that? Because what I'm trying to establish here is that platforms are, sharing economy platforms are using mechanisms that have to do with a typical marketplace exchange, such as prices, along with mechanisms that have to do with the online communities that briefly were described by Attila, such as trust and norms, and they combine them in different ways in order to become successful in the business environment that they are competing. So what are the consequences? Well, the consequences, as you very nicely mentioned in the poll, is that most of the traditional industries are contestable and vulnerable to sharing economy platforms. Why? Because as we explained before, these characteristics that sharing economy platforms have, combined with digital technologies and digitalization, they scale up the effect and they can actually challenge some of the traditional players. In the previous slide, I also show you how this challenges the traditional supply chain, right? The traditional intermediaries are not necessary anymore. And the most interesting part is that these platforms, they don't need to own the resources. They're simply managing resources that belong to individuals, which somehow reduces the cost of a new company entering as a sharing economy platform in an industry, and creates an unfair, perhaps or not, competition. And maybe it is time now to see the last poll, if possible, that has to do with regulation.
Yeah, I'll just launch the poll, so just give us a second. It is, which stakeholder has most? No, this one, sorry. Yeah. So now we have the, should this be, yeah, the final poll? So should the government regulate sharing economy platforms like normal businesses? And people, they start voting. Just give you a few seconds. And last 5 seconds, and then I'll close it, and I'll share the results. So we have 50% who say yes.
Okay.
Yeah, interesting.
Very interesting.
And 17 saying no, and then 33 saying I don't know.
I think that my feelings are similar to somewhere in between, because sometimes I think that yes, we need regulation, but on the other hand, we cannot treat these businesses as normal businesses, because they're not normal businesses, right? They're different. And the question is, do we believe that they create value to a particular industry, or do they destroy and cannibalize customers and value from existing players? I will try to argue, I don't know if I will manage to convince you, that they create value, which means that maybe regulation-wise, they should be regulated differently than traditional businesses, so that they have the flexibility to actually provide and create new value in specific industries. So what is interesting here is that in order for platforms to exploit the number of users they have and make the most out of it, they need to somehow find new ways, different ways than simple pricing, to coordinate the interactions and the transactions between supply and demand, basically the participants representing consumers and those that they sell the service. And how do they do that? They do it by governance and new rules, or different rules than what you would see in a traditional marketplace, where somehow they decide who should access the digital platform, and how the different sides should interact. So the value from these digital platforms is to find the service that you want, the time that you want, and at the quality that you wish. And this is not a simple task. So even if they are not experiencing the traditional costs that we actually saw in previous slides with traditional businesses, they have to invest heavily on algorithms and software that will allow them to use data from previous interactions of their participants and match them in the future interactions with the best possible match. So this kind of sorting, this kind of matching that takes place, it's actually a pretty expensive exercise. Why? Because it implies that the participants are active a lot, and somehow these companies has found the right way of managing network effects. So they have two problems. The first problem is to create a critical mass of users in both sides. And the second one is to make these users active, so to manage them in such a way that they're happy, they return, they use the platform again and again, and that somehow creates a positive feedback loop. Now, what are the problems if this thing doesn't happen? Is that you may have a high quantity of selections, but not the quality that you need. And guess what? In these environments, it's relatively easy for users to move from one platform to the other, or even to traditional businesses. And then we have two problems that somehow cannot be solved with prices, because most of the markets are actually solving the supply and demand disequilibrium through prices. But here, because of information asymmetries, or the so-called market of lemons, that you don't necessarily know who is the supplier of the service that you will get, or the ideal resource that you will use, right? You need to find a way that will somehow give you trust to the platform and to this unknown supplier or seller to interact with. And there is where actually they're using data of previous transactions, ratings, reviews, to actually build specific rules and find the right matches. The second thing has to do with the competition within the platform participants. So if we have too many taxi drivers, and they all compete for a low demand of taxis at a particular time of the day through Uber, this will actually reduce the prices and maybe create a negative effect for them, and that will push them out of the platform. Similarly, if you have too many apartments available somewhere in Denmark, in a small city, at a period of a year that there's no such high demand, this again can create a problem and a difficult competition for the suppliers that may actually decide to leave the platform and find different ways of offering their services. So this actually has to do with what we mentioned before, the network effects, and how they can either work and create a positive feedback loop. And here I have an example of Uber, or I will in a moment show you a negative loop. So what we have here is that more demand for transportation services will bring more drivers out, and this, if it works well, it will actually reduce the time that we wait for a taxi or for a service, and at the same time make more services available to them and actually create the value for both sides. However, this can actually, if not appropriately managed, create negative effects. Because, for example, if there is not enough demand, or if there is too much supply of taxis, that could create problems of congestion, or it can actually challenge through competition the pickup time and the service that each driver can offer, and actually push both drivers and consumers in some situation out of the platform. So somehow pricing is not necessarily the solution to this problem. That's why we need actually to include mechanisms that come from online communities and the more traditional notion of sharing that you heard before from Attila. So just to clarify a little bit about pricing, you know that probably from your own business, pricing is a very nasty business. If you don't do it well from the beginning, you will have problems. And in our case, we have been working a lot with the case of couchsurfing that, I don't know, maybe some of you have used before, but it is a platform that started by offering services for free. And then one day they decided that they needed to make some money for a number of obvious reasons. And guess what? It was almost impossible for them to find the right pricing mechanism to use. Why? Because people were used to receive the service for free. It was a particular platform that was not viewed in these traditional settings where prices were coordinating supply and demand of the services. And that actually challenged a lot and is still challenging this platform. So what I'm trying to say here is that it is important from the beginning to identify how you will use prices if you are a sharing economy platform, and how you will coordinate the use of prices with other mechanisms in order to make the most and become a competitive value-creating player in the specific industry that you are in. So what I'm trying to establish here is the importance of prices, which could either be driven by supply and demand, as we will show you later on with our model, or it could be simply cost compensation, which is a less aggressive way of pricing and has to do more with the idea of online community where people or peers are interacting with each other and they try to compensate potential costs that they incur from this interaction. So we identify actually in our research two dimensions which are important to consider if you're a sharing economy platform differently depending on how you would like your business to evolve. One has to do with how you actually coordinate your participants to compete or not to compete against each other. And this we actually relate with the notion of rivalry, and in particular with the way that prices are set, as I will explain in a moment. And the other one has to do with what I explained before, these governance rules. So how much you control the interactions between the different participants. So what we notice is that these sharing economy platforms in general follow traditional strategies like cost efficiency or differentiation. And we could somehow broadly diversify them that way. And if sharing economy platforms focus more on cost efficiency, then what we expect to see is high rivalry among participants. So prices that they are actually defined by supply and demand, and they create this competition between the participants, and they control interaction among the two sides of the market by coordinating and monitoring every activity that is taking place. So think, for example, Uber, right? In Uber, as a user, you don't have the opportunity to choose whether driver you want, but a particular driver will be allocated to you, and you can either accept or reject the service. Now, before I move to the second strategy, I think, and since we mentioned Uber again, it's a good time now to see our next poll.
Yeah.
And I want you to think, after this discussion that we had up to now in my presentation, whether you think that anybody could actually benefit from the presence of Uber in the industry. And we actually propose a number of industry players. And the question here is not whether Uber is a problem for these industry players, but whether any of them or some of them could benefit.
Yeah, and I'll just launch the poll. So the question is, which stakeholder has the most to gain from a sharing economy platform in the local transportation market? An example given is GoMore. Just give you a few.
Yeah.
A few seconds. Yeah. And the last 5 seconds. So if you want to vote, it's time. I'll just close the poll here and share it again. So 29% is saying car manufacturers, and then you have 57% saying public transportation services. 0 saying taxi drivers, and 71 saying local authorities.
So actually, I used the example of GoMore instead of Uber on purpose, because obviously Uber is not in the Danish market, and it has a lot of political, let's say, sometimes also negative, I would say, value around its name.
Yeah.
But it goes the same with GoMore or any other sharing economy platform offering relatively similar services. So what we see here, and actually I was fishing for the second group, for example, is to identify which stakeholders can actually make value out of it. And obviously the car manufacturers, they can see a new potential group of buyers of their cars, assuming that some individuals will take this particular sharing service as more of a profession rather than a random activity. So more cars theoretically will be sold. But what I also find interesting is the second and the third one. So the local transportation, I wonder why you think that the local authorities would actually, not the local authorities.
It should be transportation?
Yeah, services, the public transportation services. So why do you think that they will benefit from it?
Oh, okay, you mean this one?
Yes, the second one.
Yeah.
Could anybody who answer, actually the second one, give us?
I can see we actually have a hand raised.
Okay.
So
yes.
If it's, the hand was lowered. If you wanna, okay, that's a bit time. If you wanna say anything in regard to that question, please feel free to type in or raise your hand and say why you chose that one. We don't have anyone raising their hands right now, but if they do so,
it would be very interesting to hear that, because I see both the public transportation services offered by specific companies and the taxi drivers as theoretically kind of competitors of these platforms, right?
What if it's a taxi companies? Or what would that have an effect?
Probably, I don't know. I must admit that I don't know. I think that maybe people perceive that as something related to the second item, right?
Okay,
so the public transportation or transportation services.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Cool.
So the question there is, why can they benefit? And the answer comes from economics, saying that the more competition you have in your market, the higher your incentives to innovate and become better in the service quality you offer. So actually, to gain back the customers that you think that you are losing. And we have seen that actually that in different presentations and discussions. I don't have factual evidence because Uber left Denmark, but we do see many experts actually viewing Uber or this kind of sharing economy platforms as beneficial for the local players and the competition because it makes them become more professional. So something that has happened recently in Denmark is that most of the taxi companies, they now develop mobile applications and other online services that are actually offering a much simpler service to consumers, right? And makes their life easier, which is part of the service offered by Uber, this efficiency and the facilitation of service provision. So what I'm trying to say is that I don't have any hard facts supporting that this is related to the presence of Uber in the market, but at least I observe that it happened in relation to the presence of Uber in the Danish market.
We actually had a comment which says in areas with limited number of taxi, then private persons can contribute to taxi services. I say, yeah, but I mean, that's pretty much the Uber, and you just came across that.
And thank you very much for the comment. So just to return a little bit on my description here of the strategies, we have the second group of companies following the second main strategy that I'm sure you have heard of before, that has to do with service differentiation. And for these platforms, what we observe is that prices are not as aggressive and as competitive as in the first case. They are set sometimes as a compensation of the cost incurred between the two parties. And somehow the platforms are supporting this idea of collaboration and cooperation or not direct competition among the participants in the platform. And this is combined with other coordination mechanisms that they allow for building of trust and they use a number of norms. So they support a lot the idea of online community. Why this is happening? Because in case of service differentiation, we want to motivate the participants to come up with something new, and they can do that only if they feel a lot of trust and motivation for doing so. In the first case, we were trying to find an efficient solution, so we didn't care that much about the role of the individual supplier or seller. So it is this difference that somehow creates the key dimensions of the four models that we identified, and maybe Attila would like to join us here. And
yes, he would. Yes, thank you. So just to finish up our little presentation here, we came up with a very simple overview. It's there to help people who are interested not only in this topic, but also to find a way to categorize, classify what's happening in the environment. So this 2x2 we came up with, it's supposed to help entrepreneurs who are thinking of launching a sharing economy service themselves, but also incumbent services industries who want to scan the environment for sharing economy platforms entering the market as competitors, but also who want to be more innovative in their service offerings, right? So this can also be used by incumbent industries who are interested in being more innovative in terms of sharing services. Typical examples of incumbent industries doing that is, for instance, Amazon is relying now more and more on its fleet of private individuals driving the Amazon Prime packages around. It's basically Uber run by Amazon, delivering packages. And also if you think about, for instance, Tesla has a long-term strategy for its cars. When they are being sold back or bought back by Tesla, they can then be used for self-driving services by Tesla, for instance. So there is more to sharing economy platforms than we have, than we observe at present. So it goes way beyond Uber and Airbnb. But just to help you with getting an overview of whatever, if we dimensionalize this, we have a 2x2, and if you just follow on the screen, we have top left is where we have loose control and high rivalry. That's the archetype of the chaperone, as we call it. So Airbnb is a typical example because Airbnb is chaperoning the market. They have loose control by offering standardized norms, and they are also recommending prices. It's not predefined. And you, as a supplier, then choose what price you want to charge, and you therefore are somewhat a competition with other hosts on Airbnb. If you compare that with tight control and high rivalry, so that's the Uber model. And as Johannes said, this is more about efficiency increase. So there's tight control from the platform owners, in this case Uber. Everything runs through the Uber app, and you can just accept or deny the offering in terms of the driver. If you're a driver, also, but also if you're the rider. And if you go to the bottom two, these are maybe examples that we usually don't talk much about. Bottom left, we have loose control and low rivalry. And here the typical example is couchsurfing, Joanna mentioned already. So it's an alternative tourist sharing economy platform where typically young people stay at each other's couch for free. And here, couchsurfing as a platform owner, the corporation running it, is not very much involved. They allow the users to negotiate the terms of the service themselves. The only requirement is that you're not allowed to charge any prices for it. But otherwise, it's more or less organized like a gift economy. So this is very good for innovation. And the last and final one is what we call the principle, where we have tight control and low rivalry. The example we are here providing is Handy. Handy is kind of a TaskRabbit, or competitor TaskRabbit, focusing mostly on cleaning. And here the point is that you want to have a standardized and guaranteed quality service. So rather than allowing your users or your suppliers to compete each other, maybe lower the standards. Because of that, you have fixed prices, and then those prices are assigned depending on the quality your suppliers are offering. And this is very good if you want to have a handle on the quality you want to offer rather than efficiency. And these are the four archetypes we came up with as a help for people interested in the sharing economy.
Great. So that was the presentation.
That was the presentation, yes.
So now it's time for you out there to ask questions. If you have any, please type them in, and then I'll forward the questions. But I have the first one. The sharing economy sometimes seems to have an impact on a lot of people in societies. So what are the societal implications of the sharing economy? I'm definitely I'm thinking about employee rates and stuff like that. Does it create value in a society, or how do you see it?
So there are a variety of implications, and I want to talk about those we may not really think about that much, right? Which are usually in the blind spot. And that's if we particularly think about labor platforms. So we have the asset platforms like the Airbnbs, where you as a supplier bring an asset to the platform. And you, of course, treat it very nicely because Airbnb needs your house and your flat and your palace or whatever you're offering. But if you're bringing labor to the platform, then the dynamic changes slightly. And the power dynamics change slightly too. So for instance, if you think about TaskRabbit or Handy, as we mentioned here, that may have quite wide-reaching implications on labor institutions, or what we consider to be labor and the unionization of it, right? So just think about what difference it makes if you as persons providing labor on a platform is not in direct contact with other laborers. So just the lack of identification with other laborers that minimizes your interest in unionizing, for instance, right? So because you don't identify yourself with the other who's providing the same services. And also this disassemblage of the idea of a job, that you now rent out your place on Airbnb and drive for Uber, and then you go cleaning on Handy, and then you help somebody with the homework on another. So it's the idea of having one job maybe actually disassembled into tasks, and those tasks being then assigned by platforms.
And if somebody wanted to go a step further in this discussion, we can say that the platforms that are on the right column of our model, they tend to give space towards automation, because you try to describe the tasks in such a detail that theoretically in the long run you can replace the suppliers of the services with robots, right? So that also will have dramatic implications on the labor market in the future, because now they are collecting information and they try to describe the tasks that the platforms are offering in a way that then could be automated.
So only if you consider, for instance, Uber, it has a valuation of beyond 60 billion. It's the highest valued privately held company in the world, 65, 70 billion, something like that. And the reason why they're valued so highly is, of course, not because they allow other people to sit in cars, strangers, right? The reason why they're highly valued is because they have a huge database about individual transportation, which then will allow them to feed into the self-driving cars at some point. And that's the long-term plan.
So, so if you go to couchsurfing, I actually remember that I actually used couchsurfing.
You did, yeah?
First time, yeah. But my brother booked us in when I was in New York. I think it's 14 years ago. And so, do you think that it's because they didn't utilize data, that they didn't, in the same sense as other sharing economy platforms, that they didn't blew up? Or
I think, well, we have our own ideas on this issue, so I will start with mine, which is the most business-like. So I think that couchsurfing didn't start as aiming to become a traditional business, right? It started as an online environment, a community where people will meet each other, they will develop friendships. So they had very different ideas and goals that they are close to more to online communities and the traditional notion of sharing. However, and I don't know if it's unfortunate, but it's a reality, they face the actual need of remaining as a business entity out there and compete. Why? Because they had to invest on infrastructure, they had to do some traditional business activities. And I think that's where the problem was, that somehow they haven't thought from the beginning of the business exploitation and the business strategy of what they were doing, because they were trying to remain in a different context. That for some reason is not working. I think it's something that needs further investigation, why an online community cannot remain an online community. But now to tease a little bit, Attila, who is a great fan of Wikipedia, I will say that even Wikipedia, that is an online community, needs money.
And I have a question to that. What about because we see Wikipedia doing donations, so how about couchsurfing? Did they do that actually?
It's a very contested topic. So there are two versions of that. Couchsurfing has a long history. It goes quite way back. Before they turned for-profit, they were a non-for-profit organization, and their participants, the community members, basically helped build the platform. And the second version was built by the community members. It was actually rescued. Couchsurfing was just about to close down, and it was rescued by community members. So based on that, the implicit understanding was that Couchsurfing will become like the Wikipedia for traveling, and a truly open source platform. And those community members thought they owned the platform, practically, if not legally, which was of course a mistake, because technically speaking, what then Couchsurfing Incorporated did after they incorporated was to take those contributions as donations, because they were not allowed to keep on taking donations. So there was a huge fight between the community and Couchsurfing Incorporated. So whether it's donations or not, they're actually still arguing about that.
Okay, cool. So there's another one. Like we see that businesses when they actually start out by having this sharing economy, approach to doing business, they actually sometimes have a very good start. So my question is actually, how can incumbents prepare?
When incumbents?
So traditional businesses.
So how can they start this journey with sharing economy platforms? What do they need to consider? Well,
there are a number of solutions that we have seen out there. Some of them, they are experimenting briefly by creating a small sharing economy platform that complements their service offerings or interrupts somehow the supply chain without really challenging their main, suppliers. Or my favorite example nowadays is IKEA. That IKEA actually acquired TaskRabbit. And there you can see, for me, a very nice example of how sharing economy and traditional businesses can work together. So what you have there is people like me that they cannot assemble their furniture despite having all this very nice information on how to do so, either because they are lazy or, I don't know, because they don't want to. And then you have, instead of hiring somebody from IKEA that will cost a lot, the opportunity of accessing somebody who lives nearby with the skills, or maybe for the fun of it, to create that for a lower price. So for IKEA services, for IKEA products, this is a great value-added services that allows them with a lower cost to please and satisfy their customers, right? And for TaskRabbit participants, it's a nice way of accessing a larger pool of potential users that they would like their services. So for me, this is a relatively successful example of collaboration.
That makes me think of, you came across quantity versus quality, maybe in a different sense, but just, and also going back to the handy case you came up with. So how can businesses assure that the quality is high, or within the sharing economy?
Well, according to a recommendation, you would then go for the principal model, right? So then what you don't want is to instill rivalry between your suppliers. So if you want to provide quality, then you don't want your suppliers to try to get as cheap as possible, which then would inadvertently at some point reduce the quality of the service.
And what you also do is that you have tight control, which means that you actually collect as much information as possible for them. And theoretically, the ones that they have low ratings, or ratings that you decide that they're below a particular threshold, you can either retrain them or get rid of them in a particular way.
Okay, great. Actually, we haven't received any questions. I just want to encourage you guys to just type in questions. If you don't like to raise your hand and say it out loud, please type it in, and I can read out the questions. So, I've seen more businesses doing this. If they want to disrupt themselves, they could do like IKEA, but they also I see going into hubs and like the fintech hub. You have big corporations actually investing in these hubs, and can you see that? Because I see this as somehow they come together and disrupt industries in these hubs. Is that not a platform? But can you say that the hubs are kind of platforms for disrupting themselves? How do you see the use?
So when we talk about platform, we typically mean two things. One is this marketplace where people meet. That's what Johan has been talking about. And then the second option is then to be a core platform, and then complementers come to join in because it's an innovation platform or a platform ecosystem. And definitely that is also a dynamic that plays. And then in the digital economy, these digital platforms are super important. If you just think at home, in your office, if you have SEP, that's, for instance, now becoming a digital platform to be complementing to it. So these things have a huge impact on that too. And here we have, of course, different players competing and complementing each other, depending on which level we're talking about. So for instance, Uber very much is a complementer to Apple or iPhone. Because it's an app, you offer an app. So it's part of the same ecosystem, so it's a complement. But at the same time, at some point, they will compete each other with self-driving cars. So that's very interesting dynamics, because the old rule of my rival is my friend, my ally is my friend, and my rival is my enemy, it doesn't make any sense anymore, because rivals are friends and enemies are allies, and it's very mixed. It really depends on what we're talking about.
But overall, I think traditional companies should see that as an opportunity rather than a threat, because whatever the case, they have a large customer base that, with a little bit of more open-minded thinking when it comes to approaching the customers with new innovative services, it will easily allow them to remain competitive. I just think that the ones that they simply ignore these trends are the ones that they're challenged. For example, in the financial sector, and especially in Denmark, we have very innovative businesses, so I wouldn't be concerned that they're lagging behind, because they always play with all these startups, right? And they try constantly to experiment with new ideas.
And this can be a part of a bigger digital transformation portfolio you can think of. So in the hotel industry, for instance, we have examples of incumbent hotels that join into sharing platforms, create their own digital platforms, buy Airbnb clones, and add that to their portfolio, and try to be much more active in that regard. So it can be one element of a portfolio.
We actually received a question now.
We did receive a question.
So
nice.
Are there other social disadvantages to the sharing economy other than effects on labor, for example? anything you wanna. I'm thinking about monopoly sometimes. Before you said that data is a very a crucial or a benefit or advantage. So like, what if Google went on another, like on the Airbnb, on the hotel market, and with all the information they have?
Yeah. Well, Google has had some mishaps trying to do something else than what they usually do, but definitely the mechanics Joanna was describing, they lend themselves to this winner takes it all, winner takes most dynamics, right? Because the more users you have, the more users you attract. At some point, nobody else goes to the second provider of that services. And data has those same dynamics, right? I join Facebook because my friends are there and because they offer me services on the data, based on the data they have, which means I give them more data, which then becomes this feedback cycle. So yes, these monopolies are very, very strong, particularly with the data. We can see that with the way Facebook and Google is handling, criticism or even governmental inquiries, like in the US. They don't really care much about rules and regulations. So antitrust and regulating and breaking those apart is, I think, a political way to go about that. Also, for instance, the Chinese model, where the government plays a much more centralization role, and you have these platforms who centralize a lot. I think there's an opportunity for a European solution where you allow the private individuals to keep the data and have those platforms access it rather than hand the data over to the platforms. So that could be another way to democratize, to re-decentralize the internet, so to speak.
So yeah, there is this challenge of winner take all, where you will end up in a monopoly. But I think empowering, as Attila suggests, the individual somehow to manage their own data would somehow reduce that. And of course, there you need regulation, which we have in some ways at the European level. Of course, we need to see how this regulation will be implemented in real cases. But I think we're working in that direction. So there's a lot of concern about these monopolies, and there are traditional ways of stopping them from, achieving this market power.
But how can you turn that upside down? That monopoly. Do you have any suggestions or any thoughts on?
Usually the monopolies depends on what is it that is being traded, right? If what is being traded is very standardized and very homogenized, then there's a natural tendency of having these monopolies. If people would like more than one service or platforms offering something, then you will not have a monopoly naturally. So the question here is whether somebody can offer something different from, let's say, Airbnb, because Uber is a very particular case, so different that can remain active while Airbnb will continue becoming stronger and even become stronger. So we see, for example, Facebook and LinkedIn, they're both social networks, but they both exist because they have found their own, I wouldn't call it niche, they have found their own way of differentiating from each other. So in that sense, I think that for services like the ones offered by Airbnb, there is this opportunity somewhere for other platforms to diversify and coexist, compared to other more traditional platforms like Uber, where everything is so standardized and so homogeneous that if you have one company performing excellent in that area, maybe you don't need others, or you will need them only in specific local market as niche players, that they will never become that big, but they can serve specific local markets, like, for example, in Bornholm. That probably it's not very beneficial for Uber to go, but yet because of the level of tourism and the activities, maybe it's a great opportunity for a small platform to exist.
There's also another assumption that we have implicitly accepted as a given, but it's not necessarily, we don't necessarily have to accept that, and that is the deal we got used to is that you give me something for free, I give you my data in return, right? And that the application, the data that feeds into it, and that's artificial intelligence or whatever algorithms you think about, that these are tightly coupled, and there's not a way of doing that. So that I give my data to Facebook, Facebook does great things with it, or Uber, or whoever. Exactly, that's the only way to do it, and that is a wrong assumption. We can do it differently, and one way would be to to separate data from the app, from the application. So the application asks me, I have my data in my data account, so to speak, and the app asks me, can I access your data or not? And then you decide.
Yeah.
So to separate these two, which is not only technically feasible, but I also think necessary.
Yeah. It made me think of I had a discussion with a data enthusiast, or maybe the opposite, but she's very concerned with data, and she just had some ideas on blockchain and how blockchain, how would you would actually be able to have your data on blockchain and sell it, or I mean, so that Facebook actually had to buy your data, or any platform actually had to buy your data, and I just think that's interesting.
Yeah.
But I mean, it also made me think of, we actually have to like, how does we consider our data? Is it meaningful for us? Does it have any value?
Yeah.
And we don't see that. I mean, in maybe some of us, or most of us, doesn't. Maybe you disagree, but
I think it depends on who wants to access your data.
Yeah.
If it is the platform that offers you specific services, then you see them in a more, as you say, subtle way. But if suddenly a third party would like to access your data from your platform, then you usually start thinking a lot about issues like what will I win, what will I lose, and there you start becoming more protective over your data. The question is whether you can do anything about it or not, and that is something that needs to be solved through regulation.
But I see there's this tendency with the newer generations that they don't really, how would you say it? I mean, the older generation would be very careful about giving their data away. But I mean, newer generations on Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever platform they use, they don't mind putting up pictures and all this, which is data, out of pictures. I mean, they can streamline, or they can go through it and see what are your habits out of pictures, right? And then sell you some products. So I'm just.
I think this is a very big discussion.
So yeah,
we could have another.
We're gonna
about it.
Cool. Yes. Okay, and actually the time is almost up. Just to end this, I put in a final slide.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So we're having 2 more of these webinars with the CBS, and the next one is the 29th of November, where we'll go into IT challenges in mergers and acquisitions, and then also the final one will be on digitalization and disruption. That will be in Danish though. But yeah, I would just like to say thank you for
having us.
coming, and
pleasure.
And thank you for you guys attending.
Thank you very much.
And as usual, you'll get the video recording afterwards and the presentation. So thank you for today, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye bye.